So, Tony, what was your first memories of when we first met at Alpha? What are the things that you remember when we got together there?
I remember
about some of the regulars that were there, and
yeah, there was. I remember it was kind of a night crowd.
yeah,
Usually, most of the guys were in 10, 11 o'clock at night. And at that time, Johnny Horsfall was running the counter there.
yeah,
And there was a few players around, some that would drop in from different clubs, whether it be Embassy or Seymour or whatever it might be.
yeah. I was never around for those days at Embassy and Seymour.
Yeah. But there were still some stragglers that were around looking to
Yeah.
play, and they had an English table, of course, up at Alpha there. So there was the odd game of follow that would happen, and I think they had 2 English tables or 3 English tables there. So
We had 3 at some point, and then we cut it down to 2.
yeah, that's right.
There wasn't as much demand. Yeah,
Yeah, the game was slowing down a little bit,
That's right.
but it was always good for a lot of guys that were interested in snooker were out in that area of Vancouver were
Yeah.
coming up into that club, and so there was a few players around.
yeah. So you have a long history in snooker. When did you first really get into it? What was your memories of really first getting attracted to the game?
That's interesting because it goes back a long time ago, really, at being about, I guess, about 10 or 11 years old and seeing a couple of guys on TV playing snooker in tuxedos.
Tuxedos.
Yeah, and I didn't know whether it was a restaurant or snooker club, but the one thing I did know is that the table they were playing on looked like a football field.
Yeah.
And I watched it for a bit, and because of the fact that I had played a little bit of pool as a kid,
Cool.
I
I was
just
just
fell in
going to
love
ask
with
you. Yeah.
Yeah, I fell in love with it right away, but I had never actually been on a snooker table or been in a room that had one. So I'd been playing pool at a place that was Brentwood Bowling Lanes,
Right.
and they had about 12 4.5 by 9s, and we used to play straight pool down there. I got introduced to it by a fellow by the name of Baz Nagel.
Yeah. Now, straight pool, just so people don't know, it's 15, rack up to 15 balls and pot
I mean,
anything.
some called it continuous, and that's where you would pot, 14, and you'd leave the last one up, re-rack
right.
the 14, and try and break from that point and continue on.
Yeah.
Well, Willie Masconi is probably the most famous for that particular game.
Some people say it's good for your snooker game.
I imagine it would be. I mean, just as far as
For break
potting
building.
and break building and so on, sure. But anyway, when I got to be about the age of 12 or 13 years old, there was a fellow that came in there that when they were shutting down had said, hey, we're just going to go up to this place called Jubilee in Burnaby, and it's open 24 hours. It's a snooker club. Who wants to go? Well, I was a pretty small kid at the time, and I shot my hand up as fast as I could, and I jumped in this old Satellite 4-door big car, and we headed up there.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget opening the doors. We walked into Jubilee, and here were 12 6x12 tables, Brunswick Anniversaries out there. And it was just the most amazing sight. As the door opened, there was just this cloud of smoke. You could barely...
You could smoke at that time.
Oh,
in
of
the
course,
clubs.
yeah. And you could barely see the tables in the distance.
Yeah.
And there was the place was absolutely packed.
Yeah.
So we had to wait about a half an hour before we could get on a table. And I didn't really understand the game of snooker at that particular point, but 1 or 2 of the guys that I was with did.
Yeah.
And anyway, finally about a half an hour later, and a table opened up, and we went down, grabbed the cue off the wall, and we kind of got started playing. Well, fortunately, I could get my hand on the table because we'd played enough on a 9-ball table to do that.
Yeah.
But it really felt like a swimming pool. I mean, it was pretty big.
Yeah.
And anyway, from that point on, I was
You were hooked.
absolutely hooked.
You were hooked. You must have seen some really good top talent at that time.
Well, at that time, to be honest
you didn't
with you,
recognize
Mary,
it.
that's exactly what it
Yeah.
was. I knew that there was... The thing that stood out was amongst this whole room of every walk of life kind of guy that was in there, there were the front 2 tables by the counter.
Yeah.
And it was posted, there was a number 1 table and a number 2 table. And the thing about these guys is they were all relatively well dressed. I mean, they were wearing slacks, they were wearing a sports shirt, shaven. They all looked kind of like businessmen. And these, I found out later, were the elite snooker players. And I think it was probably a couple of months down the road after going up a few times that I just wanted to sit and watch these guys. They were amazing. So quite often I wouldn't go home with the other guys. I was
It was
13
very
years.
watchable. It was very watchable.
Oh yeah,
snooker.
and there was kind of a seating area there. So I would be sitting there, and I remember Mel, this big fellow that was driving the satellite, said, "Okay, we're ready to go."
Yeah.
And I remember telling once, "Just leave me here." 13 years old.
24 hours. 24 hours. You could stay there all night.
Exactly.
If you wanted,
And I did. I mean, I was there till I think 7 or 8 in the morning on that first night.
Now,
that
Mom
I
and Dad
stayed.
aren't too happy about this, obviously.
I didn't really have a curfew at 13.
That's odd.
Yeah, I guess so. But it was a thing where I took the bus home, which was kind of unique because you didn't have the internet to go on to find out what buses to take. I think the first ride home took me 4 hours. I didn't know where the hell I was. But anyway, yeah, that's that. I can honestly say that I was absolutely obsessed from that point on. And
it's easy to be obsessed maybe at that young age because you haven't developed like wife, kids, so it's easy to get into something.
Yeah, you're right. And being that young, you're very influential.
But yet your friends, if they ever saw you getting into snooker, they never got into it the same way you did, maybe.
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, I never had one childhood friend that played snooker. And to be honest with you, Meyer, when snooker came about, when I first got an opportunity to play it, I wasn't really worried about sports. I wasn't worried about playing in the bush with other friends doing things or whatever it was.
Yeah, the typical things.
All I wanted to do was to get up to that snooker club. And I remember I used to save money, everything from bottles to whatever the heck it was, my allowance if I got one or whatever, the odd time of getting into mom's purse. But I remember I would have to say that my lowest point that I got to as far as wanting to get money for snooker was throwing on my lacrosse uniform and going home to home in my neighborhood collecting money for a tournament in Victoria, which never existed. And I would collect money for that and then go up to the snooker club. And
that's obsession.
That's obsession. I think I got caught twice before...
Caught twice. So after the first time, you didn't give up.
Well, no, because the first time nobody really understood what was going on, and my parents found out, but there wasn't a big uproar. But the second time, what happened was I went to another, by mistake, I went to another lacrosse player's house. And talked to his mom and didn't really know, and she said there's no tournament going on, so that was a bit of a problem.
Now, did you learn from anybody at that young age when you first really got into the game? You just figured it out on your own? You had a knack for it?
Well, you know what it was is that all it was about at that time was just potting balls.
Yeah.
I understood the game as far as that you got to make a red first, and then you got to make a color. But it was a kind of thing where it was difficult to get a game because sometimes I'd be sitting up there by myself and I might have a $5 or maybe even $10 in my pocket, and I think snooker was $1.50 an hour then or something.
Yeah.
And I didn't really know anybody. I would have to ask somebody if they wanted to play when they came in. Yeah. I was still pretty small at that time, so it took a little while, and then a couple of guys gave me a few tips along the way.
Who were they?
But then,
who were those names? Do you remember?
There was one guy. I'm trying to Gary Cooper.
That name sounds familiar.
Well, I'm trying to remember if that was just an old actor or whether that was this guy's name. But anyway, he was a pretty good player. He'd knock in 40, 50 breaks. A guy named Stu Loringer, who everybody in the Burnaby area
knows that name.
Of course. They gave me some hints.
Stu still plays.
He does, yeah. He's he used to work behind the counter as well. So if there was nobody in there and he was there, he might play a couple of games with me or show me a few things. But I left home at the age of 15. So I moved out to White Rock, and there wasn't much snooker out there. There was actually a club that had 5x10s out there with one snooker table that I think mostly what it was used for is people putting their coats on.
Yeah.
And I talked to the owner there. I was working at Dairy Queen at the time, and I actually had my own apartment at 15 years old. And anyway, so I made a deal with him because I wasn't making much money. I would go in and clean all the tables, and I got to practice whatever I wanted on the snooker table. Yeah. So I think that's where I really kind of got more involved in practicing than just looking to play. Mm-hmm. So that was, I think, probably a good age for me also to understand how.
It was a little bit by accident too, because there wasn't too many people playing on the 6x12.
That's right. I don't remember really ever having a game in that place.
And how long did that last? For a couple of years?
No, that was about just over a year. But I do remember sporadically at 15, my landlord knew I was underage.
Yeah.
And he was just a nice guy, just took a liking to me. And I remember one time I was just coming in the front door, and we got chatting for a few minutes. And I told him that I was taking a bus to go and play snooker in Burnaby at this Jubilee Club. Mm-hmm. And he asked me if I knew how to drive, and I said sure. He threw me his keys for his 1963 Valiant, I think it was. It was a push-button transmission.
Wow.
And he said he never asked to see my license. He said just put some gas in it and be careful.
Yeah.
So I got a few times that I got to drive out there from.
That's hilarious.
Well, yeah.
There was you mentioned in your notes you had a spinal disease. There was something that happened at the age of 26. So did I miss anything in the story between that time?
Yeah, there was
26?
actually at the time, when I moved back into Burnaby, I was about 16 years, just after 16 years old, and I moved in. My parents had gotten divorced, and my mother was living in South Burnaby, which was only about 10 minutes from the club.
Yeah.
So I went and stayed with her, and I started working at a sawmill just before I was 17. So that was pretty good money. Mm. And we basically, from that time, was really the advance for snooker for me, because the time I spent practicing, I got to pot the ball pretty good.
Yeah.
And then at that time, there was still a number of players around, and I was hanging around Jubilee a fair amount. And there was a morning where, it was a weekend morning, that I was doing a little bit of practicing, but there was nobody in the club. It was about 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, and 2 Chinese guys walked in. And the one was standing near the table where I was hitting balls, and the other one was on the other side of the room. And I asked him if he'd like to play a game. And he said no, but my friend will play it.
I know who this is.
So, yeah, that happened to be Tommy Lee.
Tommy Lee, yeah.
Well, I knew nothing. Yeah, very well-known player throughout BC and Canada. Yeah. Exceptional player. And at that time, you know, if you're playing on the front table, you're usually going to play for something. Well, you know, I decided we're going to play for a deuce a game, $2 a game.
$2 a game, yeah.
And I remember about half or 3/4 of the way through the first game, I'm thinking, this guy only takes reds and blacks. and
that's very unusual. You don't see that.
Well, I mean, I really still didn't know a lot about the game at that time.
So this was then 17, 18?
I was just before I was 17.
Okay.
Then, yeah. And anyway, he knocked in balls from all over the place, and you know, he's only like 5'5" or something, or 5'8", I don't know. But anyway, he managed to make his way around it, and I just remember not getting to make any balls. So I remember that session cost me $4. I lost it in the 2 games, and the pool time was $1.75. So that was over pretty quick for the 2 frames that we played, or whatever it was. Especially because Tommy was never known to be a real quick player either. Yeah. But I realized very quickly this guy's going to take every penny I got, and at that time, $2 a game, it wouldn't take me much to go empty. Yeah. But anyway, so that's where I met Tommy, and I played with him as much as I could. And from that point on, he knew that I was just new in the game, and he wasn't going to take my money. Mm-hmm. But
he was good that way.
Yeah, he was very good that way. So, you know, he gave me some tips here and there, and worked with me a little bit, and played some games with him and so on. And of course, I paid for all the table time, so whenever I went up to the club, I made sure that I had X amount so I could get a few hours in with him. Yeah. And then over a period of time, Tommy Lee is purely the only reason I developed the long game as far as being able to pot from 11 feet, because he's probably one of the best safety players I've ever seen.
Yeah, you were forced to pot from that.
Well, it's the only time I got to play. I had to send a lot of flyers out there to actually ever get into the balls. And then the other thing that was kind of good about it, I guess, was if I did pot something long, I wanted everything on that half of the table, because I didn't know if I was going to get another chance in.
Yeah, on the scoring side, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So
in the short game.
Yeah. Yeah, and then, you know, I played with him for a number of months, and then I started to get interested in playing some other players and so on, and I got to meet a few others. But I think the highlight, which I remember like it was yesterday, was at the age of 17. Rene Gauthier was in the club, the brother of Tom Gauthier, cue builder.
Now, a lot of people don't know Tom Gauthier is a cue builder here in Vancouver.
Exceptional cue builder at that particular time, and everybody in Canada wanted his cues.
Cliff Thorburn has his cue.
Yeah, still to this day, there's a lot of players that even if they're not necessarily playing with his cue, they've got one on a wall somewhere for sure.
Absolutely.
And Rene was a very adequate player, very good player. And we were practicing over on table 2, which you had to do if you weren't gambling. And during one of the first couple of games, I'd got an opening early in the frame. There was only 1 or 2 reds gone. And had knocked in, at the end of it, turns out 108. So it was my first century.
Wow.
And it's hard to put into words just how exciting that was. 17 years old. I mean, I dreamed about having a century because I saw other guys have them. And to be quite honest with you, Meyer, if I knew that I was in the 90-something, I don't know if I would have folded over the next few balls, but Rene was smart enough not to say anything.
Kept quiet.
And so, of course, when I found out that I had my first century, it was so uplifting. Yeah. I think at that time, what it said is if you ran a century, you were a player.
You were part of a game, part of the elite group.
Well, I don't know about that, but in the sense you obviously could play the game. Yeah. So that was such a high point for me, and I'll never forget it. And as a matter of fact, I saved the shirt I was wearing.
You saved the shirt?
I had it 36 years.
Wow.
Yeah, until we moved last year, and some vermin got into the rafters and made a nest out of it.
Oh.
So I thought, well, it's time to let it go. But obviously, that's how much it meant to me. So, amazing. After then, it was like the second wave. Yeah. Now,
floods of centuries.
No, not necessarily floods of centuries, honestly, but I couldn't wait to get to a table. I mean, I wanted to play every single day, every hour.
That happens, yeah.
And of course, what did also happen is that I was always focused on if there was 10 reds or more, because I wanted another century.
I do that now. I never used to really think about it, but once I started and I knocked in a couple of centuries, I always look to see, okay, is there a century on? It's a very interesting thing.
Now, I guess that's good and bad. It's not really necessarily all that great in a competitive sense if you're going to plan on playing in competition.
Sure.
But because there wasn't a lot of that going on and I didn't know the difference, I wanted to make everything.
Now, do you want to talk about some of these plaques, or do you want to mention other parts of the story from that time when you were in the 70s?
Well, we can probably move on because this came about somewhat
a bit later,
right? Yeah. But
the surgery.
Yeah, I think after that, what happened is about the age of 19, I joined the BC Snooker Association, and there was sort of a new breath for the snooker in BC at the time, and started to play in some tournaments that were held locally here, whether it be at Seymour or Ace Billiards or wherever it might be. And it was kind of an awakening for snooker for me as well, because a lot of these players that were playing that would come in out of town from Kelowna or other places were very good players, but they played snooker. They didn't just run balls. Yeah. And that was good for me.
They played a more complete game, is what you're saying.
More complete game for sure. Yeah. And also they're very adequate at running whatever amount of balls they run. So
40-50s is no problem.
Exactly. And if you're playing in the best out of 5 or the best out of 7, and they knock in the few 40s and 50s while you're trying for 100, all of a sudden you blink and the set's over, and you're out the door.
Playing proper match play.
Yeah, so we had to learn a little bit more match play,
moderation
involved with it, and so on. So over the next couple of years, I played in a number of tournaments. I never fared well. I didn't really do well. Won a few matches, but a lot of the players, the stronger players at that time, were guys like Tommy that had been around for a while. Everybody from Len Homachuk and all those, just a slew of guys that were in Vancouver at the time. Jerry Kapczynski, Johnny Bear, Jimmy Bear, a lot of these fellows that were playing in those tournaments. In all honesty, even though I'd had 100 break, playing against these guys they were somewhat beyond me. So, and by the time that I started to play a bit better, or tournament-wise, snooker took kind of a sideways turn again, where it just slowed down. There wasn't a lot going on, and it was kind of difficult to stay focused. So a little bit of time went by, and then I guess that leads us up to around the time that I was about 25, 26 years old, and I'd worked in the food and beverage business because it was a type of job that with snooker being a nocturnal sport,
It worked out well.
that it worked well for me to work until 11, 12 o'clock and go into the club until 8 in the morning and then go sleep a few hours. But anyway, I had started to have some tingling in my hands and a little bit what you call like tennis elbow and so on. And the long and short of it, it took about 6 months to find out that I had a very, very rare spinal disease. It comes about one in every 900,000 people. And it eventually meant that I was going to need surgery. And it was going to mean also that I would be away from anything physical for quite some time.
That must have been debilitating when you found out.
Yeah, it was very difficult. I mean, to find out that at that time there was really no information on the disease. It was basically, pretty much where it said no cause, no cure.
Yeah.
There was no information. There was no research money put into it. Anyway, long and short of it, I had the surgery a number of months later. It was very difficult to find a surgeon that could do that particular surgery at the time, but there was a brain surgeon in Vancouver who had witnessed the surgery once and felt he could do it. And I was running out of time as far as starting to lose limbs and so on. So anyway, the operation got done. It was very successful, but I was out of commission physically for about 4 months before I could actually even really get up and get around. And then I was off another probably 14, 15 months to get physically mobile. So in that time, I could get around, so there wasn't much in the way of YouTube or anything on TV at that time. So I used to get my mom to drop me up at the club, and I would just sit there watching the guys play. And
maybe hit an odd ball.
Nope.
No?
Couldn't get over a table.
Couldn't get over a table. Wow.
No, it was probably just over a year before I could actually even bend over to pick up a ball out of the pocket.
Yeah.
So it was tough. I mean, I remember sitting there watching guys play, and at that time, VHS tapes were available, and the big machines were going on. Yeah. I must have wore out 3 or 4 tapes. I mean, actually wore the tape out watching these things. And I'd be up at the club, I'd be watching the guys, and it was so difficult, Mari. I mean, I just wanted to jump up from my chair, grab my cue, get on the table.
Run a century, because it's in your head how to run a century.
Anyway, so yeah, it took quite some time, and when I did get over the table, it took a lot of adjustments to be able to get into a position of striking a ball, and I was very fortunate to have met a fella by the name of Doug Bogle, who worked in a golf shop next door. It turned out that he was a hell of a snooker player, and he actually used to hang out with Cliff Thorburn quite a bit in the day that Cliff was around the old Jubilee. Wow. He was an exceptional teacher of both golf and snooker. So he worked with me for about 6 or 7 months to readjust my body, to get over a table, alignment, all that sort of stuff. Everything changed at that point. But I have to say, at that particular point, I have no idea how many centuries I'd broken by that time. It'd just be guesswork. It wasn't a ton, but it was something that I always remembered and always carried with me that I wanted to keep doing. Yeah. So once I got back to playing, it took another probably 4 or 5 months, 6 months to get to the point where I was consistently able to get over the table for any length of period of time. But once I did, and once I got the cue in motion again,
once you got in line, once you got centered,
I had and also the desire, because the fact that during my operation I had to sign off on a waiver that if I lost my legs, that I wouldn't sue the hospital because they had to work that close to my spinal system and my nervous system. But anyway, so if you thought I was obsessed to play snooker before, now you talk about hungry. I didn't want to eat. I didn't want to sleep. I just wanted to play. And it took, I think, maybe another 2 months after that to knock in another century. And then there was just a flood for the next probably, 8 months or 9 months. It was just a flood of constant centuries.
Is that where these come in?
No, these actually came more in when I got back from England.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So we'll talk about that. Let's talk about the
yeah. Well, it's funny how that came about too, because ever since I watched those players on TV when I was a kid, I dreamed about going to England.
Yeah.
It was the only thing I really wanted to ever do. Is I saw them, and I just wanted to be there and be doing that. And in the interim, over a period of time there, after a couple of years, my mom had passed, and I'd been working quite hard. As I say, there wasn't a lot of snooker going on for a period of time, and I'd saved some money.
So let's take a break on that for a second, and we'll pause the recording, and we'll just check to make sure that it works, and we'll talk more about England.
Okay. Okay. So around the that time that snooker was slowing down again, and I had been working quite a bit, so not playing a ton. And at the same time, my mother had passed away, and I had a very small inheritance that came my way. I was feeling somewhat stagnant playing snooker. There really wasn't anything going on. A lot of the guys, it was kind of the new generation, the Ross Bradsons, the Glaskys, a few others that were still playing, but it was very quiet for snooker, really. Tournaments had kind of dropped off a bit. And I remember that I started to miss the competitiveness of it, of playing snooker. And I decided that I'd leave my job. Could always go back to it, but I want to take
food industry, so you could go back to it.
You could go back to it, yeah.
Yeah.
And so left my job, and was practicing a little bit more for no other reason than that I had time on my hands. And I remember sitting in in Jubilee one time with absolutely nothing to do. And I thought to myself, what's the next step? What am I going to do? Do I want to continue playing? Do I want to continue working? Wasn't quite sure. So at this crossroad one day, I'm sitting there, and I just happened to think about the time when I was a little kid and I was watching snooker on TV. And I thought, wow, I thought about England a number of times, and a lot of guys that I played with talked about ever going there, and it was obviously just the heaven and compared to anything to go and play at. So I thought, well, there's nothing holding me back. So the next morning I went down to the passport office, and I went in to request a passport, and they asked me when I wanted to leave. I said, tomorrow. And they said, well, it takes a little bit to get your passport, but if you want to leave right away, we'll give you a 6-month passport, and you can have that in the next 2 days. I said, okay, I'll take that.
Yeah.
So over that next 2 days, I booked a flight. Which was a little distorted. I had to go to Seattle first, and then there to Heathrow and so on. But anyway, had it booked, and went down and got my passport and got some paperwork finalized with the bank so that I didn't have to have a return ticket when I got to England.
Okay, yeah.
And next thing I knew, I was on my way to Seattle. And I thought while I was in the airport there, I thought, maybe I should let somebody know that I'm leaving the country. So I sat in the bar. I had about 2 hours to wait for the plane. And I started to send postcards from Seattle, saying, "See,
I'm in Seattle. I'm on my way to England."
on my way to England, or whatever it was." And sat there drinking Black Russians, and it was like the first time I went up to the snooker club because I was so excited, and I was just vibrating.
Yeah.
Well, of course, getting on the plane, I was half in the bag there, and had a couple more drinks. Thought, well, I'll just sleep along the way, and then realized if you're over 6 foot, it's very difficult to sleep on an airplane that long for 9 hours. So I got off the plane in England, and I was still drunk, and I had nowhere to go. I had no contacts. So I went from the plane, down the set of stairs, got my luggage, went to the bar. I really didn't know where to go. Sitting there having a beer, and there was a fella next to me with a Canadian flag on his coat.
Wow.
Recognized him from the plane, got chatting, and he asked me where I was going, and long and short of it, he said, well, my sister lives here. Maybe she, she's doing some modeling. She knows some people and whatever.
Yeah.
Just come with me. We'll go get in her car and we'll figure it out. So sure enough, she dropped me off in a place in Earl's Court and introduced me to a guy that had a hostel in there. A lot of people that worked there were staying at this hostel fairly often because it was open to staying months at a time or whatever. So I ended up in a room with a guy from South Africa and a guy from Scotland who were both in the construction industry. And our room would have been about the size of the snooker table.
Wow.
But it was only £7 a day.
Yeah.
So, dropped everything off, got in a cab with my snooker cue, said, take me to the closest snooker club you got, but don't want to pay over £5 because there can't be a snooker club that far from here.
Yeah.
So he dropped me off at a club called the Ritz Snooker Club. And at first I thought it wasn't open because when I pulled on the door, it didn't open.
Yeah.
But there was a buzzer.
Yeah.
Well, apparently there's a lot of private clubs over there, and I just happened to pull on the door. There was one. Anyway, the gentleman let me in, and absolutely gorgeous club. There must have been maybe 16 or 18 tables in there on 2 floors,
Wow.
private rooms,
Wow.
full bar.
That's a dream.
It was just beautiful, yeah. So the manager came out to meet me, and we chatted for a few minutes, and he found out that I was from Canada and just there to play a little bit of snooker. So he gave me a guest pass to any of the Ritz snooker clubs that I went to that would get me in the door, and yeah, it was there. They were very hospitable. So, and I still have a picture, which I don't have here, but I was so excited that it took me about 3 games that I played with a fella just to get my hand on the table. It was just vibrating.
Yeah.
And about 10 o'clock that night, I had a century break there, which was pretty cool. So we lined up the balls.
That's on the
to read
first
out.
day.
Yeah, it was on the first day. We lined up the balls to whatever the century break was, and then this fellow that I had it against was standing beside me, and we took this picture. And I'll never forget this guy because he's a younger guy, good player. And when they introduced me, they said, and this is Phil. And I said, Phil, and he said, yes, with a PH. So it was kind of just a funny guy. But anyway, after playing there for a little bit, they said, Tony, you know, there's not a lot of competitive players here. If you want to get to a place where they have more tournaments and things are going on, this is the train that you take, and it'll take you up to this particular stop where when you get out, you basically cross the street, and there's a place called King's Crossing. That's where a lot of the players
King's Crossing, yeah.
Yeah, so went up there, sure enough, the door's locked. Well, obviously another private club, and went up the top of the stairs. This one, again, had, I don't know, maybe 20 tables, 24 tables. And as you walked in, you looked across this, what was initially a lounge, and there was all these panels of glass up. Well, what it was is the bar was a soundproof area, so it didn't disturb any of the snooker players. And I look out there, and there wasn't many players, and so on. So I got to talk to the fellow at the bar, and eventually ended up taking a set of balls and just practicing a little bit. And anyway, this fellow that was looking after the counter had come up about an hour and a half later, and he introduced me to this Oriental fella, and he said, you know, he plays a lot here. A few fellas like to have a game. So we played for a couple hours, and it was great. It was awesome. He's a good player and very, very nice fella.
Competitive.
Yeah, and competitive. And that was the first time that I saw what happens at 3:30 in the afternoon there, which was when all the school kids got out. And so, of course, some of them made their way into the club. And I saw maybe half a dozen or so that all had a rack of balls coming through that doorway from the private lounge or the quiet lounge there. And they all went to different tables.
Yeah.
But from the point they got to the table, they were all doing practice routines. They
Wow.
never spoke to each other. They were not goofing around. These are kids that are 9 or 10 years old.
That young.
That
Wow.
young. And all of them were practicing routines and all the rest of it. And I thought, wow, that's very interesting. Anyway, so a little bit later on, I was up there just after dinner, and somebody from the bar there said, well, are you going to play in this midnight tournament? And I said, well, I didn't know anything about it, you know, but sure. What does it cost? And they said, well, it's a £5 entry, and the house throws in £25 as well. I said, okay, well, what does that $5 entry fee cover? They said, well, it covers your table time, covers your entry, and there's a breakfast afterwards.
Wow.
Okay, breakfast. Okay. So anyway, it turns out there was only 8 of us playing.
Yeah.
And I made it through that first couple of rounds to the final. And I thought, wouldn't that be cool? I'm in England, and wouldn't that be nice to be able to...
And it's just a local tournament within the club.
Just a club tournament,
yeah.
So anyway, I got to play this fella, and he broke off, and I had a small break, and then I had a break big enough to win the first frame. And of course, now I'm thinking, well, this is it. And I never saw another ball. Wow. He won 3-1 in... Well, he had 2 centuries in that 3 frames that he won.
Wow.
And anyway, I was very...
How old was this person?
He was probably then about 17, I guess, or 18.
Wow.
So there was another unique thing that happened is that when you finished your game, everybody else was still around. You have breakfast together. All the players sit in this dining room or whatever, and you have breakfast together.
Yeah.
So as we're sitting there, this fellow that I lost to was asking me, do you know Cliff Thorburn? Do you know Kirk Stevens?
Yeah.
Do you know all these guys and Bill Warbanuk and so on. And we're talking about snooker in Vancouver in Canada. So he asked me, so what are you doing here? And I said, well, to tell you the truth, I mean, this is the elite for snooker in the whole world. I just wanted to be in the place that it's at, learn as much as I can, play a little bit, and so on. He said, well, are you interested in playing some more tournaments? I said, well, yeah, if I could, sure. He said, well, if you take the train home and then come back in about 6 or 7 hours, we're going to head out to a tournament. You're welcome to join us.
Wow.
Wow, that's great. So anyway, while we're talking, I look up on the wall, and there happens to be this hand-drawn poster of this young guy, and I'm looking at him. I'm looking at the poster. That's him. It says Peter Ebdon, first maximum break, 15 years old, something like this.
Yeah.
That's you. Yeah. And at the time, I think he was number 2 to Ken Doherty, if I'm not mistaken.
So you didn't even know who Peter was. You played this game in the finals, lost him 3-1, and you didn't realize who he was. That's amazing.
Yeah, and it was over pretty quick. So,
yeah.
But yeah, I didn't know who he was, and so over the next while, I got the opportunity to practice with him just about on a daily basis.
Amazing.
And play in a number of tournaments, which were, again, it was if he didn't happen to win that tournament, we were off to another one. There was one day we played 3 tournaments in one day, including another house midnight tournament. But
yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah, these were tournaments where there were 60,
this
70, 80 players.
Back in the 80s and 90s?
This would have been in the very late 80s, yeah.
Very late 80s, yeah.
Very late 80s. And there were a lot of people that were trying to get a hold of Peter to become his manager. I think at that time he was being offered everything from cars,
wow,
and Mercedes,
room and board,
whatever,
whatever he wanted.
And of course they would be paying for all of his, whatever that is involved in having a manager. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But anyway, it was a hell of an experience, and I think the thing that I learned most from it was something we never experienced in Vancouver or in BC or in Canada, is not knowing who your opponent is.
Not knowing who your opponent is.
There's so many people playing the game.
Yeah.
There's so many competitive
you've been
players.
in England for many years. You don't know
I
who
guess
you're playing.
so. And even then, these guys half the time didn't know each other. I mean, you're traveling to different places where these tournaments are, and the game is so strong at that particular time. So in that way, it was very good for you mentally, because if you knew a guy that was, let's say, for instance, in your local club that was known to run a lot of balls, you'd know there's going to be more safety involved. If a guy if he stayed close to making his 16, 24 and hiding, this is a guy that may want to force the balls a bit open and so on and so forth. There you never knew. So it kind of forced into more of a regimented type of game.
More match play. Yeah.
Yeah, and again there, I could probably, it felt like I could count on one hand the amount of matches that I won. It was very, very disciplined. And here at this point, I mean, I'd had a lot of centuries, in the time I played, and it didn't count.
Compared to the guys in Vancouver, right? You were in the elite crowd, but when you go over there, you're just like,
little fish.
Little fish, right?
It was exceptional though, and I spent 6 months there.
Yeah.
And then it was time to come home, and I booked a flight. I was very sorry to go, and I look forward to the next trip back. But I went with a lot of most incredible memories, and really, really had a great appreciation for those that earn their way to,
Now, did you ever get a chance to meet guys like Hendry and Ronnie, and did you watch them? Did you see them? Or it was just you and Peter, and then that was at, 6 months or 12 months that you practiced them?
About the 6 months that I was there, and it was only a few of those months that I got to spend with Peter. And at that time, him being an amateur, unfortunately, we didn't get to a Pro-Am. There was nothing really close to Central London that I was in that there was any pro tournaments going on at that time.
So he's a little younger than you, right?
Yeah. So
during all that time when you guys would play, the 6 months you're playing every day, was it just you wake up, eat, and it's just snooker?
Sometimes not eat.
No girls, no drinking, no partying.
You know what? Beer over there.
Peter's not known for that anyway.
No. extremely, probably one of the most intense, directed people I've ever met.
That you've ever met.
That I've ever met. I don't know. I didn't really know that many people that winning was that important to. And I don't mean just for the art of winning, but for the fact that he wanted the best out of himself full time.
What do you think caused that? Was it different than your desire to win? I mean, your desire when you went to England wasn't really about winning. It was about just experiencing England. But for him...
Yeah, it was different because...
What drove him?
I think with Peter, it was an individual thing that makes the difference between the average guy and the guy that excels. He had an extremely, very, very great talent. He had a great concentration level. Hated losing probably more than he liked winning. But he was very determined. He took his game very seriously. He was never really screwing around. There's times that he took for his own practice. But the one unique thing that I learned there is that in practice, when we're at home here, we tend to play games for practice, right? We'll play a best out of something, whatever
sparring.
it might be. Kind of sparring on a table. And we're kind of makeshifting a tournament type of a style that we're doing to improve ourselves. With Peter, it was more like going to the range. Because what he would do is if we had an hour and a half to practice before heading out for matches or whatever, we'd break from the back.
Break from the back, okay.
Break from the back, open all the Ritz. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, you're getting in stroke. Mm. And there were lots of times where as he's getting in stroke, I'm watching. I'm spotting balls. And then after a period of time, as soon as he got in form, he would spend the next half an hour, 40 minutes just feeding me.
He would do that?
Feeding me into the balls so that when we went to the tournament, I wasn't cold and I wasn't just warm from spotting balls.
Wow.
So it was a great way to practice, and then there's other times you're going to practice more in a match play kind of format. But, it was interesting. Yeah.
So you left England?
Yeah, when I left England and I came back to Vancouver, I think that, people that I was in touch with when I was over there a little bit, it was hard to put into words what that experience was like. I think that because all my goals were met, going to England was not about trying to get a pro ticket. I was already 28 or 29 years old. I mean, I think what I really wanted to find out was...
You were single.
Single, yeah. I wanted to find out what my best could be. And not really would I make it into pros or, that kind of thing. It was more realistic at that age than that.
Yeah.
But I did want to play in a competitive field that would push me to a better level, put it that way. And I certainly found that. I also found that there was a different respect for the game that I had before, where going for 10-footers all day long was something that I did without even thinking. And that kind of changed a little bit. It was not so much about having the 100 breaks as it was really having respect for the game that in all of its facets of how it's played. So it changed. And getting back to Vancouver, I went into the club a few days after I got back, into the Jubilee Club. And I played one of the locals there about 3 frames of snooker on one of these old anniversary tables, Brunswick anniversary snooker tables. And I remember after about 3 frames, I looked down at my hand for some reason, and I realized that my hand was black from all the dirt on the tables. And then I realized my fingernails were full of dirt after 3 frames. And I realized I started to pay attention how difficult the table was to play on because it was sluggish and it didn't play like an English-style table. And
balls are dirty.
Well, everything's dirty, right? Yeah. And then I don't know. I didn't have a plan of playing tournaments again from that point or really any aspirations. So I quit. Yeah. I really didn't have a purpose in playing, and practicing was kind of pointless and so on. So that was although I didn't feel like I lost anything because I gained so much going to England and
it was such a great experience.
Yeah. And then a few years later, just a couple of years later, I was working at a hotel, and I used to periodically, every once in a while, when I get the urge, I'd pop down to a place called Big Games in Port Moody, and it was owned by a couple, Kathy and Bob Strachan, and he used to be a numbers guy, an accountant,
The numbers, yeah.
And anyway, he bought this club and he was bringing in a couple of English snooker tables, which is part of the reason I wanted to go and find out about this place. And I played down there every once in a while. But anyway, on this one particular Thursday or Friday, I got a call from Bob Strachan. And he said, "Hey, what are you doing tomorrow night?" And I said, "Well, I got a date." And he said, "Well, what are the chances you could come down to the club?" I said, "No, I got a date." He said, "Well, I got a kid down here that we had to ban from the juniors. He's 13 years old and he's knocking in 70 breaks."
That's
so
odd. That's very unusual, especially in Canada.
Exactly. I mean, so I canceled the date. I had to see who this kid was, right? Anyway, so I went down to the club on the Saturday night. And I remember walking in, and the counter was just to your right as you walked in, and then there was the first table, and there was a kid standing there with was obviously his
It was very raw.
Very raw, yeah. But he made most of what he went for. So we played about a half a dozen games or so. And then his father, Willie, asked me, he said, "Can you work with my son a little bit?" I said, "Sure, I'd enjoy that." And, my thought was we just get together every now and again for a session and, I don't know, maybe talk a little bit about the different aspects and so on.
Yeah.
So we did that. We started to practice together a bit, and I'll never forget at that time, Marco was playing with about a 15-ounce cue, and it had about a 9mm tip, maybe 8.5, I don't know, but this thing looked like a pen, like an arrow, yeah. And the butt end of it looked like an old fence post. It was just this worn out. It had some black in it, and it was maple, whatever. And I still remember it had this white plastic joint in between the two.
Yeah.
But anyway, over a period of time that we played together, Marco was he was of a different level for a kid that was 13 years old. His concentration level was exceptional. He reminded me of some of the kids that I saw in England. Very determined, very respectful, very modest. And so we played together for a number of months. And then I realized that the type of teaching that he needed is something that maybe I wasn't qualified for. I was very much a field player, not so much in the technical end of things. And I didn't want to do any damage to him. I didn't know what his aspirations were.
Because you'd lead him astray very easily.
Exactly. I also really didn't want to teach him my game. He had one of his own already. So I introduced him to Tommy Lee, and Tommy came up and he worked with Marco for a period of time, which was exceptional for Marco. Marco was like a sponge. He just took in knowledge like crazy. And between the time he was 13 and 15, both of us actually closer when he was 15, Marco and I both qualified for the Canadian Championships that were being held in Guelph, Ontario. And we went there, and it was kind of neat because Marco was the youngest to ever qualify for the Canadian Championships at 15 years old.
Wow.
And the first dinner that they had on the night, I think it was the first night everybody arrived and registered and so on, there was an honorable mention to Marco for being the youngest ever. However, he wasn't allowed to attend the dinner. His mother wouldn't have allowed to go because there was alcohol at this venue. So he unfortunately missed that particular dinner. He played well in the tournament. He didn't make it out of his group that particular year, but a lot of people were certainly paying attention to this young fellow that could play.
Yeah.
So that was a unique time, and a short time after that, Bob and Kathy had moved their club over into Coquitlam called the Embassy Club, which they had a number more tables. They incorporated more English tables. They became the presidents of the BC Snooker Association, and they began to get more tournaments running. So all of a sudden I found myself wanting to play again. Marco was a big inspiration. He was improving very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And at that time, his father bought an anniversary from somewhere and emptied out their basement, and they put this table in there so Marco could play there. Now also he's very disciplined because he had to do well in school, and then he could practice snooker. So we practiced a lot at the Embassy, and I think he was about 16, around that time, that he came into the club. We were getting together on a weekend, and he came into practice. I had already had the balls racked waiting for him. He walked in. I broke off as he was taking his jacket off, and he ran a maximum.
Wow.
And I'm obviously very proud to, him having his first maximum against me. I mean, I was, by that time, pretty good at spotting balls for very good players. So it was an absolute pleasure to watch him perform that on that table.
Do you think Tommy Lee helped him a lot?
I think so. You know what? I think Tommy would help anybody in the sense of he had a very computerized way of thinking about snooker.
Yeah, very technical.
And the greatest thing I think Marco's attribute was in learning from Tommy was he took what he felt he needed and he left the rest out. But he's a very smart individual and he picked out the right things. And so
that's very surprising, because typically a student that's learning, they don't know what's wrong and right of the new things that they learn.
Well, that's it. I mean, it's hard. It's how you can't really compare him. I guess in some ways to almost like a Tiger Woods, where to Marco, winning was second nature. Performing at a high level was just second to him.
You can even see that now in his game. I mean, of the few people that can beat up Ronnie, or when Marco plays Ronnie, you don't see Marco getting frustrated or flustered. Ronnie can knock in 2-3 centuries in a row, and Marco can still win that match.
Yeah, and it's funny. You look at the win-loss ratio against Ronnie O'Sullivan, and I think at one time he had I'm not sure, but I think he had the highest ratio against him. Yeah,
he did. That's right. Yeah, he's one of the few.
I think in one way, when you look at a guy like Marco, the game is tough enough. He never had to battle any internal demons. So
that is very.
It's a dangerous fellow to play against that is playing to that level.
Yeah, and him not being a field player, when he has issues in life or difficulties, it doesn't, because he's got a technical approach to the game, or maybe a little bit more of a technical approach to the game. It doesn't bother him, right?
No, it didn't seem to. Marco was one of those guys that technically he worked things through his mind very well.
Yeah.
But he was also very fluent at the table. He had his flow at the table. He had a great tempo while he was playing. And I think that was very intimidating to a lot of guys, because it didn't matter what they did. Marco played his game.
Yeah.
And for a period of time there, after Marco turned about 17, he was beating, there's really not many people in the city that could beat him.
Yeah.
He traveled, I think, to a couple of tournaments. They didn't actually win the Canadians, but at that particular time, there was only a couple left before he left for England.
Yeah.
But I do remember he played a match against John Bear, and it really was not much of a match. Marco was pretty dominant. Yeah.
Yeah.
Also at the time, John Horsfall was playing a lot of snooker, and playing well. John's a very mechanical player, but put his work in and played very well. And that one, Marco, again, I think he won fairly dominantly over that. Just the kind of guy that he plays technical when he needs to.
Yeah.
And when it's time to pop balls.
He's still got flow. Still got lots of flow. Lots of natural.
It's great. Yeah. So at that time, for me, I was playing more. There was more tournaments going on in the city, and I think that's more coming into play of what we're talking about here
with these badges. Sure.
Yeah, there was a time where I won a tournament at Chenet Billiards that was going on, and it was a qualifier for another tournament that was happening. I was beginning to compile, a lot of centuries again at the time, and that's where some of these plaques came in. we've got one here that when the embassy closed down, Kathy gave me the plaque, and one of the plates that's missing on this is Marco's 147.
Oh, okay.
That came off of there. But also, I think they gave it to me because I own most of most of these there, and then another club that I practiced at a lot, the Club 147 in Langley, which I knew of before, but started to spend more time with Bill Beadle.
And then what are these trophies?
This one actually is probably the most that I could ever be proud of a trophy, because we were playing the Western Canadians here in Vancouver, and that time Marco had won 34 matches in a row.
Wow.
In the tournaments that he'd played. I think he won the BC Amateur and just a slew of everything else, but he just hadn't lost a match. And I met Marco in the semifinals of the Western Canadians, and beat him 5-3.
Wow. And that's a big deal, because that's when he's at his height, and you
at that time he was at height for sure.
Yeah.
And I'm coming away from that. I would have to say Marco was maybe 70% that day is what it felt like, and what I've seen before. For me, I was playing well, and I really had nothing to lose. I think the expectation was that Marco was going to win. It was a surprise when I actually potted the last ball and won that match. In fact, so much so that when I left that match, I was so mentally drained that I had absolutely nothing going into the final, and unfortunately lost that, because it was that time for the number one spot at the Canadian Championships.
Wow. I
still qualified for the Canadian Championships, but really it was my gun was empty by the time I got to the finals. But Marco is such a gentleman to play with. He was happy for me. He of course would have liked to have taken that spot, but that of course is what brought about this trophy for being a finalist there. So
that is a big deal.
It was probably the proudest I ever was performing in a tournament, regardless of finishing first or not.
Yeah.
So it was just around that time also that Marco was just starting preparations to be leaving to go back to China, and then be going to Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, also Marco, I was looking after a club at that time in New Westminster, and Marco joined me there for an exhibition exhibition match that we had to also put money towards the New Westminster Hospital, and so on, which a lot of people showed for and stuff. It was a great time, and that was unfortunately one of the last times that I got to play with Marco.
Oh, that's too bad. Well, maybe we'll have a rematch one day if Marco ever shows up in Vancouver.
I would love to spot balls for him again. So, yeah, and at that time, it was again, snooker started to slow down. That's about the time that I really got away from the game for a longer period of time.
Yeah.
Would grab a cue every once in a while, but it would be more aggravation than anything else. So
where does Bill Beadle come into the story for you?
Bill Beadle is probably one of the most unique people I've ever met. I met Bill Beadle when I was about 14, 15 years old at the old Jubilee. He's about 5'5", I guess, 5'6". He's always been bald, never seen him with a shred of hair. He used to be a prison guard at the Ocala prison in Burnaby. Very, very intense fellow. So I had met him, but didn't really talk a lot to him. He was also quite good friends and played somewhat with Cliff in his day at Jubilee. Bill was one of those guys that was just exceptional at everything he did. He was a jewelry maker. He is I understand if the word is right, knighted in regards to wines.
No, oh, okay.
He's a Scotch expert. He's also been on the top elite few in target shooting with, I believe, pistols and rifles.
Wow.
Worldwide.
It's a very eccentric individual, it sounds like.
Very, very eccentric, yes. Exceptional person, though. I haven't met a lot of people with as much integrity as Bill has.
Wow.
And I crossed paths with them once again when we were playing at big games in Port Moody. And then, of course, when the Langley Club opened, they had a BC Westbury that was world condition. Mm-hmm. They had the same cloth brought over and put on and so on. So as soon as I got a call from Bill, they had this table out there. We played a lot of snooker over a period of time there. And being in the food and beverage business, I opened a restaurant for him in conjunction to the snooker club. So I was there all the time, and that's where there was a few of these plaques around that we'd taken over time. And not that the Century's ever easy to make, but on an English table, just the way the pockets take, they were certainly, I found, easier to work with. They were more available, let's say, side pockets and so on, from tougher angles and so on. So that was a great time. So Bill and I played there for, I guess, a year or two, but I've been in contact with him ever since. It's probably not usually a couple of weeks go by that we're not on the phone chatting
hear from each other, yeah.
Yeah, and of course we enjoy so much talking about snooker in the olden days and what was going on and all the people that we knew. And Bill asked me a question just a short while ago. He said, well, if we opened a club, how would you like that? And I said, quite honestly, I would want what snooker was, not what it is today, unfortunately, in BC.
Yeah, I think the crowd, if you did open a snooker club, let's say in Burnaby or New West or Vancouver, you'd get a totally different crowd than what it was before. I mean, you could develop those century guys that knocking in centuries, but they'd have to learn from someone.
Well, you're right. And the whole turnover of younger to more experienced and that type of player is really not around anymore. I think part of it is because the game is so challenging and so difficult. It requires so much from a person to play. There's still lots of locals, whether it be seniors or people that still enjoy the game, but not to get to the level of...
Yeah, well, I faced that problem as well because I really got into snooker in the mid-'90s, I guess, and I never really saw... I maybe saw 2 or 3 centuries knocked in ever, personally. So, yeah, that affected my game big time.
Yeah, I think it does as far as influencing a lot of people that are watching the game. When they see it played to a level that they're not used to seeing, and somebody actually is able to take out a table with the balls and realize how difficult it is. It's kind of like golf that way. You know, we all aspire to play better golf, and we play somebody that's a very low handicap, and it makes us realize just how difficult that game is when we're out there. Yeah.
So do you want to show some things on the table? You want to show some memorable shots and things like that?
Sure, we can do that.
Because there was a few times that you talked.
There was a couple of things that came about.
I want to hear the Tommy Lee where he knocked in the right. Let's talk about that.
Sure.